When you first come across Psalm 137 in the context of these wonderful songs of praise and worship that close off the Psalter, it jars somewhat with our emotions. Psalm 135 and 136, for example, are full, as we've seen, of thanksgiving and praise. There's a real sense of jubilant worship, but 137 is so different. But that's the precious honesty of not just the Psalms, but the scriptures as a whole. They deal with life as it really is, not as we would like it to be. And the truth, the reality, is that there are times in our lives, for whatever reason, when praise and singing are just emotionally impossible. The background to 137 is clear and important as we seek to understand and apply it. It's written by one of the exiles who have returned to Jerusalem after the long decades of captivity in Babylon. I suspect that it was written soon after the return because their memories are still clear and the pain intense. There are 3 stanzas to this psalm, each of which has the word remember at its heart. First of all, in verses 1 to 3, a painful remembrance. Just picture the scene. There they are, these Israelite exiles, hundreds of miles from home, and all that is dear to them, and especially from Zion, and the now destroyed temple, and all that it represented to them as the people of God. Among the few possessions they have taken with them, some of them have their lyres and perhaps other musical instruments that they used to use in the worship of God. But what use are they now? And so they hang them redundant on the branches of the willow trees that stood along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Kibar Canal, and the other numerous waterways that had now become their home in exile. Thinking about all that they have lost did not motivate them in any way to sing their songs of worship, and especially not when their captors tormented them, aggravating their pain. Then in verses 4 to 6, we have a promised remembrance. I want to stress, says our psalmist, it's not that I have forgotten about Zion or Jerusalem. And he addresses Jerusalem as if it was a person. He speaks to it personally because in many ways for him, Jerusalem represents God himself. And what he's doing here, he is promising never to forget God and certainly not to betray him. He refers to his right hand, probably because that would be the hand that he played his lyre with to accompany his singing of the praise of God. And then in verses 7 to 9, we have an imprecatory remembrance. Now, if this psalm jars somewhat in the context of this group of psalms, this 3rd stanza certainly jars against our sensitivities. These verses are what are termed imprecatory, meaning that they call down a judgment upon certain people. There are around 14 psalms in our Bibles that have at least imprecatory elements to them. But here, in the midst of these psalms of worship, is one of the very fiercest, strongest such cries to God, especially verse 9. So at this point, we need to bear 2 things in mind. First, these imprecatory prayers are never made out of a sense of personal vindictiveness or a desire for personal revenge. They are always motivated by a jealousy for the honor and glory of God. Second, and linked to the first, is the context here, which is focused on the word remembered in verse 7. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare down to its foundations. You see, the Edomites encouraged the total destruction of Jerusalem that led to the people being taken away into exile. And the Babylonians, mentioned in verse 8, were the ones who actually carried it out. Some of that is alluded to, for example, in the little prophecy of Obadiah. And since it was a common practice in those times for conquering armies to savagely destroy not just soldiers on the opposing army, but women, children, and infants, What the psalmist is really asking God to do to the Edomites and the Babylonians in verse 9 is simply what they have done previously to the people of Israel. We also need to remember that though God had prophesied the destruction of Israel as an act of judgment and had himself raised up the Babylonians to do the work, they went far beyond the task given them by God, both in terms of savagery, but also delighting in their cruelty. So, friends, what do we make of all of this? Well, as far as the first two parts of the psalm are concerned, isn't it true that all too often, as we look around at the state of the church in our day, with its compromise and apostasy and unbelief, as we look into our own hearts often, there's so much that would cause us to hang up our musical instruments and silence our praise and just keep quiet. But you know, my personal response to this is that all our lives are actually lived in a foreign land, just as the exiles were, because this world is not our home. And yes, there is certainly much reason to be discouraged and even brokenhearted, but there is even more reason to give thanks and to rejoice. Think of the closing words of Habakkuk. Interestingly, written when God had just told him about the imminent invasion and destruction by the Babylonians that the psalmist is lamenting. And he says, though, and in context, he means not if, but when, though all this happens, and though the fig tree does not blossom, and there's no fruit on the vine, though the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, when the flock be cut off from the fold, and when there's no herd in the stalls, when the very worst you can possibly imagine happens, what will I do? Well, says Habakkuk, yet, even still, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Isn't that the right response? I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm sure it's right. And as for those troubling verses at the end of the psalm, here's a challenging thought for you. In its fullest sense, the psalmist's prayer for God's justice to be poured out on the Edomites and the Babylonians is referred to in Revelation 18 and 19, though it has to be said that Babylon there is much bigger than, but includes the Babylon mentioned in Psalm 137. And do you know what the response of the multitude of heaven is to this? Well, it's what you and I know as the Hallelujah chorus, because it's the very passage on which Handel based that amazing choral piece. I love hearing a great choir sing that piece, but every time I do so, I wonder whether those singing it know what they're singing. They are rejoicing and celebrating the overthrow and eternal judgment of God's people. So even when we don't feel much like it, and when there are many apparently justifiable reasons not to, the Christian's response is, in the words of Paul, to rejoice in the Lord always.